gosh, it's good to be together again. It's good to see you. It's a lot better than just preaching to the empty room, you know. I did move around to make you kind of double guess if people showed up and you were lazy, but you were good. Glad you stayed home. I was telling somebody recently about Westmark. Another pastor was asking me, and just tell me about Westmark. What's it like? Who are you guys? And I just started telling stories about, what we've seen God do. Some incredible things that were like, man, God has just come up and shown us so much here. He's just revealed himself here, and it was incredible to watch this person's life transform. And I always shared with him times where we've seen people healed, and I shared with him times about things that we're still wrestling through and hoping God would answer us in a certain way. And we talked about the mission, and we talked about the future, and it struck me in that conversation that I considered, man, it's wild that we all are all here. Like, it's crazy to me that God has used different things and different motivations and different needs, and yet he's brought us all here. And we could go around the room and talk about how we got here, right? If you're really short, then someone just forced you to be here, right? But as you get taller, you're harder to force to come. And so, what brought you to church? And we really discover underneath that, as you think about it, there's longings. And some of us showed up here because we were heartbroken. And some of us showed up here because it just felt hopeless and like this might just be the last call that I have on life. Other of us have shown up because it made sense, and it was true, and it was right, and we knew the light and we loved it. Other of us have arrived here because there's questions. And you show up to a place full of other kind of broken people like this, and you're like, I wonder if anybody else has the same questions I do. I wonder if anybody else has walked the hard path that I have. And it's that sort of feeling of coming together in varying shades of confusion, longing, desires, hope even, that we were brought into a room and we kind of discovered Jesus. Because even if you're somebody who's like, I only came because somebody that I do kind of generally love annoyed me enough, invited me enough, bothered me enough that I did come, and yet coming, you get to know Jesus. And you see it in other people, and you see him here, and you worship, and you're like, there's something, there's a stirring in your heart. And it's through all these different little ways, but yet we all arrive to this place where you're like, Jesus makes sense in my life. Jesus answers questions I have, and he gives the things that I need. One way to say it would be this, that Jesus makes this make sense. The world I'm living in and the struggles I'm going through and the things I don't think I can get over, and yet even just the positive things of like, I want to get better. I want to be, I have dreams and I have aspirations and forward thinking. I just want it, and you're like, Jesus makes it make sense though. There's purpose there. There's control there. There's a plan there. Jesus makes this make sense. So my searching and longings and needs are answered in Jesus. So now the call is to grow deeper. Now the call is to stay faithful and to press into what he has for us, because Jesus will make this make sense. If you want to join me in Colossians 1, we're going to continue this Colossians series, working through the letter that Paul wrote to this church in Colossae. Now, he writes this letter, and in just towards the beginning here, he gives this beautiful little poem. It's like a hymn. It's a little song. And it's written in such a way that it actually makes it very easy to memorize. It was designed that way, I believe. I think he was writing one of the first creeds of the church. He wanted to enshrine for us who Jesus is. It's a declaration about who the Christ is. Who is Jesus? And what is his role in making sense of this world? We're going to take bite-sized pieces. And I want you to look at, starting in verse 15, we're just going to take the first 15 through 17. It says this: the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. And that's going to almost be like a little title, okay? I want you to think of it. He's making that statement, and then there's going to be a bunch of things that follow that support that and explain it. So listen, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So you start thinking, real quick, can you come up with anything that would be outside of that list? It's pretty comprehensive, right? Pretty complete. There's nothing else outside of this that would define its existence. So really directly, he's just saying that Christ is over everything. He's the end of it all. He's figuring out life only makes sense when Jesus is in the center of it. Figuring out people and their role in the world really only makes sense when you have the correct view of Jesus. Figuring out your own struggles and what you're going to do to get through that, or what you're going to do with that pain, or what you're going to do with that suffering, or how you're going to help that person. Really, those things are only answered fully and completely when you understand the relationship of all of this to Jesus. Now, he's going to make this point in a few different ways. But all of us should feel familiar with it because it's the confusion and the anger and the frustration and the disappointment, a lot of those things that lead to bitterness or apathy. You might go that route and just disconnect and just distract. You have all these negative things coming from situations in your life because you look at that and you go, I don't get it and I don't know why. Why is this happening? Why are you doing that? Why are you making these choices? Why is the world going this way? And when you can't deal with it, you go against it. Paul's going to show us that all these things begin to make sense under Jesus. It's what they're for. Now here, let me point this out. The image of the invisible God. Jesus is the image of the invisible God. So when I say Jesus will make it make sense, what I'm talking about is the image of the invisible God, the picture of who that is showing up into the world. So when you understand and you can picture and understand who God is, then the world that's created for him begins to get more definition, begins to have purpose. So here's what I mean by this. Image, let's talk about this word for a second. You might recognize that. Image. You're created in God's image, right? That's all the way back in Genesis. So God creates humanity in his image, which means this creation is designed to project who he is, to represent him, to image him forth. So he says, all right, I'm creating you with this purpose, and when you fulfill this purpose, people are going to look at you and say, wow, God is good. When you live out what you should, when you live according to the design that I've given you, then people are going to look at that and say, man, the Creator is amazing. Wow, he's a God of justice and mercy and truth and light and healing and growth. Life. That's the design of humanity, to project that forward. We're supposed to live in that image. And when we choose not to, when we say, I don't want to represent God, in fact, I'm going to represent myself. I'm going to represent my own interests. I think that would go better. That's what we call sin. So when he says the Son is the image of the invisible God, what he's saying is that Jesus shows up and perfectly shows the character of God, the true heart. You want to know who God is? Jesus displays him perfectly. Jesus represents him perfectly. Jesus is him perfectly. The image of the invisible God, which is just a fun one anyway, right? Because the image of something invisible is like, how do you do that? He's the image of the invisible God. And from this, he's going to say all of creation is going to find its meaning in him. When Jesus showed us the image of who God really is, it motivated us. It's inspiring. Like when I talked about showing up to a church or showing up to who the church is, right, the people, and we begin to build those relationships, we begin to know people, there's just a sense of draw. I don't know if you've experienced that. There's a time when God is working in people's lives and you're with them and you're near them and they're worshiping and you're like, there's just something. I'm just drawn to it. What that is the perfect image of God, Jesus, being experienced, right? Like we have this desire to know the design. We have this desire to know, man, wouldn't it be great if everybody was more like Jesus? Right? Raise your hand if you know somebody in your life that you wish was more like Jesus. Anybody? Anybody? Yeah, okay. We want that. Jesus motivates us and inspires us and draws us in. There's something attractive about him because in him, we're going like, that's it. That's what this is all about. That's that quelling of fears and the way that mercy and justice can be together where Jesus can flip tables over here, but then he can sit with sinners here. The way that he can hate sin, but yet he can love souls. There's just this aspect about who he is that's beautiful, and you're like, I want that. Why? really, in one way, that's who God is, absolutely, but also who Jesus is as the perfect image is, he's the perfect human. He's somebody who can live in the image of God perfectly, and we go like that. I wish my life was like that. I wish I could view people like that. I wish I could view myself like that. It draws us. It shows us God's heart for humanity. One way to say that is that when you're with him, when you're knowing him, he calms the confusion. Jesus makes it make sense. Then we zoom out a little bit. Paul takes us back. That's who Jesus is. And we zoom out, and it says, all things have been created through him and for him. So this is all powers and authorities and everything you can possibly imagine created through him, but also for him. Meaning it's the reason it exists, the purpose it exists, but it's also the how. How are these things staying in play? How does this all work together? How is this all still going? We're on this ball spinning around in the space. How is this all? Well, everything's his. And it's for him. It finds its purpose in him. And so there's these times of fear we walk through. You guys remember the election like 5 minutes ago? Right? And everybody's all in a tizzy and things are good. There's this sense of fear and dread and danger and what if. But if everything is for him and through him and it's all under him and I trust him, what does that make my life? There's an old Tim Keller quote that Norm likes to remind me of. It says the most important word in the Christian vocabulary is relax. You can relax. This is what faith allows us to do, right? That God is good enough, and if everything is underneath his control, and Jesus is making sense of the world, then underneath him, this works. I can trust him with this. Completely. God has never been blindsided. Think about that? And all the times in your life that you've been blindsided, he wasn't. He has a plan, and his plan is going to work. It's going to make sense. God's going to make sense of this. Jesus is going to make sense of everything. Jesus makes the world make sense. That's what he does. Because it's all for him. You know that moment where you're going to put together a puzzle and so you dump all the pieces on the table. And that first moment, you're like, this was a mistake. We shouldn't do this. And it's just, you just don't have any, the outline's not done for you, right? You don't know where anything goes. And it's like, God's never felt that. He's always known. And his plan is going to work. It's going to put things back where they're supposed to be. Look at this in verse 18 through 20. We're going to see not this that Jesus makes the world make sense, but also he's going to make life and death make sense. Look in verse 18 and 20. He says this, and he is the head of the body, the church. He's the beginning and the firstborn among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. There's a lot in here, but I want to point out that Jesus will make life and death make sense. That's where this is kind of going, that within understanding who Jesus is, there's this logic about why life exists, about how it exists, about what death is supposed to do here, and how God's going to use it. And that logic is answered in Jesus, but here's the thing. It's spread through the church. That's where he goes with this. He says, okay, Jesus makes this all make sense, and he says he's the head of the church. And so the church is going to be a bunch of broken people, bruised people, messed up people that God's going to call to himself. He said, I'm going to make peace with you, and I want you to take that, I want you to take it out and tell other people so that they can have a piece of the peace. That's a double portion. Thanks, Kurt. The church has an important role here. The church, and there's an explanation here about like the relationship between Jesus and this church, that he is the head. He's the head. He's the head honcho. He's the CEO. He's running the organization. But also in this like analogy of the body, the head's pretty important to the rest of the body. It's where it gets its life from. It's what directs it. It's what cares for it. I would dare say that if you didn't have a head, things wouldn't go well. And so we're sent out by the head. It's directing us in what we should do and who we should be in the kingdom. And that's going to go out. It's going to, all right, now you need to tell people to come back and meet the head. Well, you need to introduce them to the head honcho. You're going to love him. He's a pretty great guy. The head that all things make sense because of, it's where we get our life from. So it's not just this nice concept that's like, well, yeah, we paint pictures of him or, we remember him when we pray, but that he's the central piece. Around Westmark, you'll hear us use the term Jesus abiders. What this means is that I want to be somebody that is going to balance my life by treasuring Christ most. That if I put Christ in the center of my life and everything goes this way, then I need to lose some of that to get back balanced. That if I center him and I prioritize him and I emphasize him, then what's going to happen is that's going to control my heart. It's going to control my affections. Now, these affections I have, this love for God, is going to be the defining characteristic in the rest of my life. Everything submits to that. I'm going to abide in him. My life comes from him. To be Jesus abiders, not just because it's a good idea, not just because it sounds nice, not just because Noah likes the graphic and we should put it on a shirt, but because it's the design. It's actually the only way that this will work. The design for the church is to abide. Okay, now let me show you something here. It's a little bit nerdy, okay? But I want to get in the weeds with you just for a second. Paul calls Jesus the firstborn of creation, and then he calls him the firstborn of the dead. I think that's cool. But here's the implications of that. Here's the purpose of it. Some people read that, he's the firstborn of creation. Well, I guess that means he's created. No, that's a misreading. What he's saying here is that from creation, life existed, right? Well, where did that come from? And in the same sense, you borrow that over, you bring it over here to the discussion of the resurrection. So out of the resurrection, we get life. Where did that come from? This is a statement saying that the rank, the preeminence, the firstborn gets all the glory, right? They're kind of the stuck-up kid. They're kind of the, you know what I'm talking about, firstborn, right? They get the lion's share. They get the rank. That's Jesus. Jesus has the rank. He's the creator of life. And then in resurrection, we need new life, and he creates that. He's the king over life and the king over new life. That's the joy that we get to follow the king who can't be defeated. He created life, and he promises this new life. He's the king over it both. Firstborn in creation, firstborn from the dead. Now, I want to go back to verses 19 and 20. All right, and I want to pick out a couple pieces in here. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. Now, pause for a second. The fullness of God. Paul's emphasizing this, right? He even says all his fullness, as if you can have less than, half of his fullness. I don't know what that would mean. He's trying to make this point. Jesus is God. The whole letter here is written to a church, and there's some people stirring up some untrue things. There's people starting to teach that Jesus isn't maybe fully all that God, right? He's a good guy, and he's like, and possibly, when he died, it was a death, but it wasn't like a death. It was kind of like less of a death. It wasn't the way death is death for us. It's just like a death for a different death. And they kind of get in the weeds here, and they try to pull out the power of the gospel. And so Paul writes this letter and uses very strong, very explicit language to say, let me remind you all real quick about who Jesus is. This Jesus who is fully God, who came in a physical body, who died a physical death, and that's what we preach. That's what's always been preached. That's what the gospel is, and it always has been. It always will be. And so that's the purpose of this. And so when we read that, we're like, okay, he's the fullness of God. That Jesus was fully God. And you're like, no, you're repeating yourself a lot. Well, it's kind of important. I want it to sink in. It's a major point that Jesus is fully God. Now, there's a couple things in here. Paul says that God was pleased for two things. Pleased to have his fullness dwell in Jesus, meaning that when Jesus is sent to earth, God was happy to send him. That's crazy. But it gets crazier because it says it's also, he's pleased to do what? He's pleased to, through him, reconcile to himself all things. It pleased God to have Jesus go, complete his mission, and make peace between God and God's enemies. That was like near and dear to God's heart. Well, how did that happen? If you read on, it says, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Here's God, and he says, I am pleased, I am glad to. There is joy for me in sending my son to rescue you. Like we think about this, and we kind of do this thought exercise. I'm sure it's probably not new for you, but just like think about somebody dying for you. And you're like, wow. But there's a display of God's heart in this where he's saying, I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to send my son on this like crazy kamikaze mission to pull you out, to bring you back. It's like that's love. That is mercy. That is kindness. Jesus was everything of God, and he was pleased to send his son to die for you. Man, that should sink in. That should just define the mood for the day, Now here's how Jesus makes life and death make sense. Jesus uses life as our time now to help others escape death. And then he's going to use death to usher his people into new life. That what the enemy's worst thing, the thing that seems opposite, that God would create life and the enemy would come in and try to destroy life. And God says, I'm going to use this to bring new life. And so that doesn't answer all the whys. There's still a lot of hard things in life, and there's still a lot of hard things that we butt up against into death, but there's a little phrase right here that should give us a lot of comfort. So that in all things he might have supremacy. That in all things, you know what supremacy means, right? It's like this overarching, he's the most, he's the best, he's over it all, in control of it all, it belongs to him. He's the most supreme, and what he's saying is through the gospel, through this whole thing, God's pleased to do this. He's going to send his son's going to die for us, he's going to pull us out of death so that Jesus is king over everything. And it's clear, and it's known, and it goes forward forever and ever and ever. So here's the deal. What this means for us is that Jesus has a plan, and Jesus has the winning plan. What does it mean that you get to live in the winning plan? It means that even right now, if you don't understand why, there's going to be a moment that you look back and you're going to say, oh, okay, I see it. Boy, I'm glad I trusted you. There's going to be a moment where you look back and say, oh, I missed it. There's going to be a chance soon where life unfolds and you know the call on your life to be faithful, and yet there's the pull inside of you to not be so faithful, and you're going to need to trust his plan. And when the pain and the darkness and the things settle onto you and you're like, there is no out, it's not true. He is supreme over everything. We need to trust him. Jesus will make it all make sense. He's going to make the world make sense. He's going to make life and death make sense. But if I'm being honest with you, I don't just live there. I don't just live like in this ethereal cloud of like, well, what's the meaning of life all the time? Right? And there are things in the world that concern us, and there's the wars and the persecutions, and there's the famines, and there's, celebrities with overpriced homes who build them in the middle of a tinderbox and then light them on fire, and we have to be concerned about all this stuff. But most of the time, I just kind of been living here. And if I'm being honest with you, like there's days it's just hard to get up and fight the good fight. So that's why I really appreciate this next section of the passage, because he moves it. Jesus is going to make sense of the world, and he is going to make sense of life and death, but he also is going to make sense of your life and of my life. Look at verse 21. It says this: once you were alienated from God, and you were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. It's funny. When you think about yourself before Christ, you, BC, you don't necessarily give yourself that label. Right? You kind of whitewash things. You kind of remember, I was figuring stuff out still. It's like, that's not how he writes it. Enemies, like a traitor. Like, you think about this. God's the king, and he's the ultimate king, and the king of heaven, and he says, live this way, and you say, you know what? I think I'm going to set up my own kingdom. That's called treason. Right? In wartime, like, they'll just shoot you. Treason. That's a big deal. Enemies of God, separated. Like, that's what sin is. So just in order to really understand how good the good news is, there's part of it you got to understand how bad the bad news is. Like, we were enemies. And you're like, well, it wasn't that bad. No, enemies in your mind because of your evil behavior. Like, it wasn't just, like, it worked out. Like, that was a defining trait of your life, is like you're an enemy of God. That's what it means to be outside of Christ. But that's not who I am anymore. Hopefully, it's not who most of you are anymore. Look at verse 22. He says, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. And this is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. Jesus is going to make your life make sense. He's going to make it all make sense, but he's going to make your life make sense. And the growing clarity in your journey with God starts with understanding your new identity. It starts with understanding that you have been made blameless. That's the good news. That in Jesus, you have a clean record and you're a new person with a new identity. Everybody is made clean in Christ, but so much of our confusion in life is trying to live with two identities. So much of the heaviness in life is trying to carry around two different purposes. And so much of the anxiety, I think, comes from worrying about a life that doesn't belong to us anymore. The good news is that Jesus really died a real death to rescue you from your real sin. That's good news. And out of that comes a new place, a new peace. And that peace can be this foundation now that we live on. So we confuse ourselves because of that doubt and the fear and the lies about these other identities sort of trickle back in, or maybe they're deep down in there and we haven't rooted them out. But we begin to believe them again. That's who I am. We've been trained to think certain ways. And it's not so difficult to understand. If you have, in relationships, been trained to believe that I'm going to get affection by what I produce, then naturally you're going to try to understand God in that way, that he's just waiting for me to produce enough to love me. And if you look at the mirror and there's this big black spot of shame and guilt in how you view yourself, then naturally you're going to assume that that's how God sees you. And if you think back on yourself as a broken, hurt person, drenched with heartbreak, then you're going to assume that God sees you as a pathetic, soaking wet failure. But that's not who you are. That's not who we are. Now, in Christ, we are no longer that. At once you were alienated. At one point you were separated. At one point you were enemies, but not anymore. It says now Jesus made peace with you, between you and God. Peace. Like you're brought in. You're perfect in his sight. It says you're holy. It says you're blameless. Have you ever felt blameless? You ever lived in that? Think about it this way. God views you the way that you would be if none of those choices were made. God views you as the person who never did those things or said those things. God views you as the person that those things were never done to, and those things were never said to. That in him you're this new, blameless person. And the accusations don't stick. You're so permanent, Christian, you are so permanently fixed in this identity that it won't be moved. There's no place for accusations to even come and stick to. A lot of times I'll ask my kids to do something, right? and I'll say, all right, you got to go do this. And then we do this like why, back and forth thing, whatever. And after about 3 whys, like there's a ringer that goes off in my head, and like this big garage roll door shuts, and it's like, this is closed for discussion, And so then at that point, if another why question comes to me, they get an automated response that says, I'm sorry, but we're no longer taking questions. And they can ask again. It'll just bounce back. I'm sorry, but we're no longer taking questions. And as parenting goes, it works pretty good. I'm sorry, we're no longer taking questions. It's not great marriage advice, but for the kids, you can get pretty far. I'm sorry, we're no longer taking questions. And I think, brothers and sisters, if you feel rooted to the mistakes and the guilt and the shame and the failure of your past identity, that's not how God views you. So when these accusations come, these charges against you come about who you are and how awful you really are and how worthless you really are, they're going to bounce back and get a stone cold response that says, I'm sorry, we're not taking accusations right now. That's not who they are. They are blameless and they are holy, and there's no place for them. So Satan can't define your identity anymore, but he can trick you into picking a bad one up. Honestly, a gospel like that, a Jesus like that who's not expecting from you, a Jesus who sets you free, a Jesus who forgives you, a Jesus who loves you and is glad to be with you, maybe isn't what you've heard. Maybe that's not a gospel that you grew up knowing. A lot of people don't, but it's the true gospel. And it's always been that. That's Paul's point. He's saying this is what it's always been. It's been preached this way forever. It's always been this way. It always will be this way, that Jesus was real, that he came as a real human, that he died a physical death, that he ascended to the Father, that this is actually to rescue you. This is a real thing that you really need. That's what the gospel is. And if you haven't been invited into that, if that's not the God you've known, but the God you've known kind of like carries a big hammer, he's waiting for you to mess up, just this large sense of disappointment floating in the clouds, I want to invite you to know who the gospel teaches us Jesus is. That he's kind, that he's glad to have you, that he knows you, and in Jesus, God views you blameless. You can be blameless in Jesus. Just ask. A little bit of faith in a big God goes a long way. You can trust him. You can trust him. Jesus is going to make sense. He's going to make it all make sense. And he's going to make the world make sense, and he's going to make life and death make sense, and he's going to make your life make sense. So the question for today is, can you trust him? Can you trust him to alter those little hard bits of your heart that have been bitter and angry? Can you trust him for the vague, the messy? Can you trust him to walk through the things, doing the right thing, even though you don't know how the outcome's going to be? Can you trust him to give you a new identity? Jesus will make it make sense. So follow closely.